Let's keep in touch. Let's keep in touch. Keep in touch with me. Drop me a line.
Hey, Melanie. Why don't you ask me who we have with us today?
Hey, Amy. Who do we have with us this week?
I am so excited that we have with us Jeffrey Miller, who is my second cousin, I believe. I looked it up on the internet. Our grandparents were siblings. Even though Jeffrey has been in contact with my dad on Facebook and we've shared mutual stories and experiences, we haven't really had the chance to meet and talk very much. So I'm so excited to talk with you and hear a little bit about how you got into the ESL industry. Jeffrey's been teaching since 1989. So welcome, Jeffrey, and I'm so glad to meet you and have you on.
Well, thank you so much. It's nice meeting the two of you as well, and I'm really happy to be here.
Jeffrey, this is really exciting for me. I feel like I'm meeting an elder, and I mean that in the most positive sense of the word.
Well,
I'm really excited to pick your brain and learn from you today. This is really going to be great. So, Jeffrey, I think you've probably seen a lot of changes in the ELT industry, but I would love to start by just asking you a little bit about how you got started and what that process was like for you and when.
Okay, well, actually, I got started back in the summer of 1988 when I was in graduate school. I went to Western Illinois University, and of course, I was working on my MA in English at the time. And during the summers, between my first and second year of graduate school, there was a notice in the English department. They were looking for teachers to teach writing and reading. They had what they called the Wessel Institute, which was Western's ESL Institute, where students who went to Western and international students, and they'd done okay with TOEFL. Now you got to remember, back in the 80s, TOEFL was, they didn't have sort of the writing component that
Right.
They do now. Okay. And also, I think in terms of vocabulary, and I know that, of course, they have very vocabulary heavy, but students who scored got a certain percentile on the TOEFL test, they were admitted to the university with the belief that they would take extra classes in order to bring their scores up. Okay.
It sounds to me like a very early stage foundation, or what we'd call an intensive English language program today, which is now much more structured than it sounds like it was then.
Yeah, so they would come to Western. And in fact, some students actually would take the class, sort of beef up their language skills. So they were looking for teachers from the English department. Obviously, we're learning, English department, in sort of heavy on composition, all that we would teach, reading and writing. So I applied and I got accepted. It was a summer course, and I taught, like I said, reading and writing. It was a very small course. I had a few students from Japan. I had a couple kids from Colombia, and it was like during the summer. And of course, I'm taking classes at the same time, and I kind of just going in there, doing some reading, And to be honest with you, I really had no idea what I was doing. Okay, I'm teaching it just like I would teach a composition class. Give a paragraph, read it. Some basic sort of comprehension, have them write a little paragraph. I'm correcting their English. For the most part, just what we would do sort of like in a standard sort of, freshman composition class. But we were, of course, dealing with, international students.
Second language speakers. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So I loved it. I thought this is really great, because at that time, I really wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with my life. I thought, well, I want to go on for a PhD. At this point, this is like 1988. So like I'm 30 years old at this point, because I'd done 4 years in the military. Okay, so I was in the Air Force from 76 to 80. Got out, kind of, thought I was going to study filmmaking. It didn't really pan out for me. Went back to a junior college, went back to study filmmaking. This is not for me. Ended up going to a private university, a small college outside of Peoria called Eureka College. Then I went on to Western to pursue a degree, English in creative writing, because at that time, Western had a creative writing program. So here I am, I didn't know what I wanted to do. Maybe go on for a PhD. I don't know. So I started teaching, I taught this class and I go, wow, this is really cool. Now at the same
That's
time,
so funny. That's exactly how I felt the first time I taught. I was like, hey, I kind of like this. I think I could do this.
exactly. Now, at the same time, one of my friends he was actually a instructor, a theater instructor at Eureka, but also he was one of my good friends because his brother was my roommate. He was in Japan as part of the JET program.
Oh, yes.
And he said, hey, you might want to think about this for a year or two. And I thought, that's, at that point, I had never really thought about teaching English as a second language. So I go back.
Had you ever traveled outside of the United States at that point?
Other than when I was in Panama, because I was stationed in Panama for 2 years back in 76 to 78. And that was the only time I'd been out of the States at that time. So anyways, summer, I taught the course. I loved it. And at that course, when the fall semester began, my friend, of course, was doing a JET program at the time. And then I was finishing up my MA. And it was right around Christmas, of course, January, it's like my last semester. That's when reality hits you. Like, my gosh, I'm going to graduate in 5 months.
Oh my God.
I better start looking for a job. So again, my friend's in Japan. He said, why don't you apply to the JET program? So I looked at it, in the JET program, it seemed it's too sort of governmental for me, too much paperwork. So because when I was teaching at Wessel Institute back at Western that summer, I became friends with a guy named Mark Cleland. And Mark Cleland, he had taught.
I know him. Ah, what a world. Anyway, please carry on. I've met him.
Okay, anyway.
I worked briefly with him in Dubai. How funny.
That's right. He was in, yeah. So Mark Cleland and his wife were teaching at Wessel. And I guess he had been in Thailand, and he also taught in the Middle East, if I'm not mistaken. And he said, maybe you ought to get into this field as well. So I got a copy of the TESOL Quarterly. They had classifieds, and there was a job in Japan. It was called the Four Seasons Language School and Cultural Center, and I applied. They sent a letter back and said, "You want to come?" And I said, "Okay." And I sent one other letter to Pagoda Institute, which is located here in Korea. So this was in April. I get a phone call April 17th, 1989. And it's the director saying, hey, we'd like to have you come. So I went to Japan, but things did not work out for me in Japan for a number of reasons, okay? One of the reasons was, I just really lacked the experience in teaching. Some people are really good at going to a foreign country and just being able to teach, but to me, it was like I was like on vacation, And
I was going to say, are they though? Are they really? I think some people are good at faking it, but I don't know. I
had a really good time. I packed in a lot, and one day I was called in. Actually, my director came to my apartment and said, I'm sorry, but things are not working out for us. I don't really know exactly all the details, but it seemed like a couple days later, a teacher showed up and just started working. So, anyway, so I come back to the States, and I taught at a junior college. I taught English as a second language at a junior college, and kind of remembering what had happened in Japan. I obviously not going to repeat the same mistakes. It was adult education class. It was an extension course, and I was teaching. Most of them their families were already in the States, and brought their mother or their cousin, and I was basically teaching survival English. How to fill out a application for a credit card, open up a bank account, how to pay your gas bill. Really practical and functional stuff. And it was really a rewarding experience because finally I really could see the fruits of my labors. Whereas in Japan, you're teaching English because the one thing I learned about teaching English is that for many years, it seemed it was kind of like the thing to do, to learn English. It was really, no one had any sort of well, what am I going to do with this English?
It's trendy.
Yeah, exactly. Over the years, students said, well, I want to watch movies, or I want to travel, which, okay. But let's face it, if you're going to travel, you're not going to really learn a language to travel. I mean, you're going to travel, most people in a tour group, you're going to go to the same restaurants that the tour group leader wants to take you to. You might speak some of the language, but not a lot, okay? But this ESL course was really, really eye-opening for me. While I was teaching it, again, I'm still in contact with the Wessel Institute because I really want to get back overseas. And again, I'm getting copies of the TESOL Quarterly, and there was another job opening, and it was through ELS. I don't know if you're familiar.
Oh yes, I'm very familiar with ELS. I kind of consider them like the Starbucks of English language teaching. They are just everywhere.
Exactly.
Wherever you are, not unlike Kaplan. Kaplan is also everywhere,
right.
But ELS I think might even
ELS,
be bigger
right.
than Kaplan for English language.
Yeah,
yes.
I'll be talking more about ELS later because I have nothing but good things to say about ELS. Of course, at the time, I mean, I've heard a lot of horror stories since then, but it was through ELS, and they're going to open up a new school in Malaysia. So I sent off my application to Culver City. At that time, the recruiter was based out of Culver City. Her name was Dory Rank. And she called me back and said, yeah, we got your application. We got your CV and all that. And yeah, I mean, you seem like, you've got some experience and all that. We had a phone interview. I passed that. And she goes, now I'd like you to go up to Concordia College. We had an ELS school on the campus. So I went up there and, it was like, I'm in the school and I see all these international students. And I go, man, this is great. I felt really, really confident that I was going to get this job. And because I thought, I got overseas experience. I mean, they're going to, they're looking for, in fact, the entire staff. So I went through the interview and I thought it was great. And about 4 weeks later, I get the phone call and they said, sorry, but they were looking for teachers with just a little bit more experience teaching. And before our telephone conversation was over, Dory Rank said, hey, we've got job openings, in Seoul opening up all the time. Would you like for us to keep your file on record? And I said, yeah, sure. About 4 weeks later, I get a phone call and she said, would you like to go to Seoul? And I said, yes. When? First week of December. And she said, yeah. I said, now I know it's right before Christmas, but you'll be so excited you won't even miss home. And she was right. So on December 7th, 1990, I landed at Gimpo Airport and began my sort of journey. And that's where I've been, of course, been here ever since. The reason why I thought there's a couple sort of interesting stories here is because I mentioned before Mark Cleland. Well, then later on, Mark Cleland became the recruiter for ELS.
Man, that guy gets around.
So he was like sort of recruiting for ELS, okay? And that's what brought me here, okay? That's what brought me to South Korea back in the 1990s.
I really want to get a feel for what it was like to be teaching in Korea in the early 90s. What kind of qualifications do you have? How many? Because Korea is such a huge English language spot. Now it is. I went to Korea, I want to say about 8 years ago, maybe somewhere between 6 to 8 years ago. I remember I was in a cafe and I heard two English speakers going over a lesson, and I actually heard that their grammar point was wrong. It was I don't know if you know the expression a busman's holiday, like you can't escape your job. I remember listening thinking, no, you're wrong, that's not the point. But my point is there are just so many English teachers in Korea now, and I wonder what it was like then.
Now I want to tell you something about ELS. I loved ELS. ELS was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. Because at that time, it was run by Shisa Yongosa. And Shisa Yongosa was the leading, if not the largest publisher of English education books in South Korea. They were also sort of the importer. So they were bringing in stuff like Side by Side. They're bringing in Expressways. They're bringing in the Spectrum series. Now, these were the books that we used. Okay. Now I know a lot of teachers, they don't really like Side by Side. They don't really like expressways.
Oh, yes, I've heard a lot about it.
I love them. Okay, and probably the reason for is they reminded me a lot of Mad Magazine. I don't know why, but the cartoon.
That's hilarious.
But there's a reason. ELS, as you mentioned before, they're kind of like the Starbucks of English schools. But at that time, there were 3 ELS schools in Korea. There were 2 in Seoul, one in Cheongno, one in Gungnum ELS near Gungnum subway station, where I taught, and there was one in Busan. Now, the thing that was really neat about ELS was that they took care of teachers. First of all, as soon as I landed at Gimpo Airport, I was given an envelope. I think it was like 300,000 won. I was taken to my apartment. Now, if you want to talk about a wild experience, my apartment was located down the street from Olympic Stadium. It was just about 100 yards or maybe 200 yards, my apartment, from the Lotte Entertainment Complex, which of course now is the tallest building in South Korea, the Lotte Tower. This is where I lived.
So you were right. It's kind of the equivalent of having like the finest area in town.
Exactly. Okay. It was only a 10-minute subway ride into work. Okay. It was unbelievable. I mean, the fact that it was furnished, television, telephone, the refrigerator was stocked. With sort of like, some water, some Coca-Cola, some cans of coffee, some crackers, some eggs. I mean, there were pans, there were dishes. Talk about a great setup. The next day, my mentor came over and walked me around the neighborhood, took me over to Lotte World. We got on the subway, went downtown, went to the Insadong, the traditional marketplace, went to Kyobo Book Center, got sort of acclimated. That Sunday took me into the school. The reason why I'm grinning is that my luggage was lost. When I left Chicago, my luggage stayed in Chicago. So, I had a carry-on bag, but I'm wearing the same underwear kind of like for 3 days. My first weekend in Korea, I had to buy all new clothes. So I had to buy shirt, pants, tie, shoes, underwear. And of course, for underwear, they don't call underwear in Korea. They call it panties. So 2 weeks before Christmas, I'm at the Lotte Superstore trying to negotiate with my limited Korean, which at that point was, hello, how are you? Excuse me, and how much are our pack of cigarettes? That was my limited Korean. I'm trying to buy underwear, and the women are saying panties. And I go, no, I don't want panties. I want underwear, So anyway.
It sounds like you felt very taken care of as a foreign teacher.
Exactly. And the thing about 1990 is that the Olympics had been over for 2 years. Of course, the U.S. has been in Korea since 1945. Okay, at the end of World War II. We had military here up until 1948. Then we had Korean military advisors, so of course with the Korean War. But since 1953, there's been a very large U.S. contingency located on the peninsula. But in 1988, they had the Olympics, and that was a big coming out party for South Korea. And because of that, there was a lot of sort of this, not interest, but, foreigners were kind of like a novelty and all that. But ELS, they took good care of us. We had a week of orientation. We would watch other teachers teaching. And by Thursday, we were assigned one teacher. It was our mentor. And like Monday and Tuesday of that week, we would watch all these different classes, like a lab class, a writing class, a speaking class. But I did watch the other teachers. And then with working closely with my mentor, I had to come up with a lesson plan. And then on that Thursday, I had to teach a class. And then I would get feedback.
So Jeffrey, that's pretty standard now for teacher training programs.
Exactly.
That's exactly what you have to do. So are you kind of saying that you basically did a paid teacher training course with ELS? Like they hired you and then they trained you?
That's a good point, because at the time, ELS was a really good school for teacher training. Because if you came here and you liked it, and some people came for a year or 2 years, and other people, like myself, stayed longer. And you got the experience is what it was. And the way that ELS was structured was that you can pretty much go in, and the lessons were designed for every day of the week. We followed there was a book called Spectrum, and they basically took the table of contents and that became the syllabus. So
Okay.
it was all sort of like tasks, like, like lesson one, like level one, introductions. How are you? What's your name? Where are you from? And if you look at side by side, if you look at, any of the expressways, it's just sort of that scaffolding, the way that everything is sort of structured, from introductions. And of course, with the grammar, like you would never teach, the present perfect in level one. You would never teach the conditionals, in book one. You just do the basic.
I'm wondering, because that was 1990 and you've obviously been there for a really long time. I'm really curious as to how you think that kind of structure has changed over the decades, or what you saw as some of the really big changes in teaching.
Yeah, I think the changes was that I consider myself old school. I consider myself, in terms of we came, we saw, we taught, that kind of thing. Many of us had very limited, like ELT experience or a background. I mean, they were hiring anybody pretty much off the streets. So ELS, in our schools, they were hiring, sort of part-time workers, to come in. There were a lot of people hiring independents. Everybody had a degree, but not a degree in ELT, or even some linguistics or something like that.
One of the things that I'm finding interesting in listening to your, early years of experience, I'm not sure if you're aware, I actually taught English in Shanghai for a year in 1996 to 97.
Mm-hmm.
But my experience was very different. I was sort of just dropped onto the university and well, you can speak English, so go teach it.
Exactly.
And it's interesting, what you were saying about the ELS process is just how much structure they had available for, novice teachers to.
Right. Well, that's a really good point, because I heard many horror stories. In fact, I was in the Gungnum subway station one day, and I when you see a foreigner, it's kind of like, oh my God, another foreigner. So, right away, you got to start talking to each other. And he told me that he came to Korea around the same time he was hired for some other language school. And he was picked up at the airport by the director. He was taken directly to the school. The director gave him his book and said, your students are waiting for you.
Wow.
Those were some of the horror stories. And there were countless other ones. I heard stories where teachers they had to live with the director, that their passports were taken away, that they had to teach the kids of the director of the school.
Oh my God.
That they had, that they had a curfew. These were the horror stories, of course. But ELS, they were sort of the cream of the crop. Okay.
Yeah, they were investing in their teachers.
Exactly. And the thing is that I think getting back what you were asking earlier, was that they had a structure, and it was very easy for anyone with very limited or maybe no background in ELT to go in and actually teach a course. And as far as myself goes, I learned a lot by the people I taught with, people who had experience. Maybe they did the RSA diploma. They had the certificate. People who had been teaching that had been in Korea when they were with the Peace Corps. They actually were back in the 70s. I actually taught people in the Peace Corps, or had taught in Africa or other countries in the Peace Corps. And I began to observe, I began to listen and ask teachers, hey, how would you teach this? Or, how would this work? And I sort of began to kind of buddy up with other teachers and begin to sort of, hey, how should I do this? Sometimes we would team teach. Sometimes I would sit in on classes just to say, well, how does that work? That's really cool. I think I'm going to try that. And a lot of it was trial by error. Now, you could get away with that back in the 1990s, but Other times you had to be very careful because it was still cowboy time, you know. And what I mean by cowboy time, I'm thinking like the Cowboy Institutes. I remember I had my roommate. He had come up from Thailand to teach for a few weeks at ELS, and he was on the phone with his friend, and I guess his friend was like looking for a job, and he told his friend, "Whatever you do, don't tell him you've been in the joint."
My God, wow.
I thought, good advice when you apply for a job. But back then, people did that. You could go to Bangkok, you can go to Khao San Road, and you could get a diploma, anything you wanted, or a transcript. Back in 2002, I think it was 2003, every English teacher in South Korea was forced to go to immigration with a copy of with official copy of the transcript and diploma. And the immigration was going to call that university. Of course, you know, it's not going to happen. It was a knee-jerk reaction to a bunch of foreigners who were caught out. You know, they were captured on TV, you know, in Itaewon, drinking, you know, yeah, I've come to Korea making all this money, you know, it's just on and on. So the people freaked out. They had every English teacher. And it turned out that there were a group of Canadians who actually had bogus diplomas that they got from Khao San Road.
Well, so the feeling I'm getting here is one of value. There's a lot of the word that's coming to my mind, and it's one that has come up many times in some of our podcasts, is this idea of value. You know, right. Your experience when you first arrived, clearly you were valued as a teacher, and it's interesting to hear Amy's experience, which, you know, I'm not saying you weren't valued, but it was a little bit more dropped in it. And I think that's often an issue with this industry, even when you mentioned this whole idea of cowboys, which anyone who's been in the English language teaching industry for a while knows about this phenomenon, because really at the end of the day, we all have something valuable, which is the proficiency in English language, that in theory you can easily give to someone else. Now, we know it's a little bit easier said than done, but you know, when you tell me that, I'm sure there are some people who did a great job who maybe didn't have much training, but they were
exactly. I totally agree with you.
You know, I personally think it's good those people got busted. Talk a little bit about your experience over the past year teaching during the time of COVID in Korea.
Right. I would like to say one more thing too about what we were talking earlier, and that is that one thing that I think what happened in South Korea was that slowly but surely we were able to eradicate the sort of backpacker mentality, where people would come here, and there were a lot of people who kind of felt that English teaching was very easy, that anybody can do it, that you could just put in a cassette player, you could put in a cassette tape, push the button, and that's it. Anybody can do it. And I think the thing that was really difficult for a lot of people to realize is that not just that we are replaceable, and this is the thing that we had to try to change the mindset, was the fact is that you can't replace experience. And one thing that I have gotten over the years is the experience. And the only way you get this is by doing it. I tell you, I had a class of housewives back in 1993. There were no coffee shops like today. There was no internet. They wanted to learn English. So you give them what they wanted. You kind of structured lessons. You talk about, like, you know, going here, going shopping. You talk about things. And you kind of begin to get a feel for language, and you can see how it's being used and how to be able to not teach, you know, but to sort of show, okay, this is how you would do this. And I think we began to sort of see how English can be used, how to help people, because, you know, let's face it, Korean students, okay, they've been studying English for 6 years by the time they get to university, and they are so frustrated that they can't speak English fluently. So it's how you kind of sort of approach your lessons to sort of deal with this. Okay. And
although if I can bring in some theory for a minute, there is the whole idea of transfer value, which is if you need to learn another language, then you're much more motivated. But if you're already living in Korea and everybody speaks Korean, you're surrounded. What's really your motivation? I mean, sure, it's cool, I guess,
Right. Yeah, there's that motivation, and I think that's a big factor. So, I mean, there's a whole nother thing we could talk about, but you wanted to talk about what this past year. Well, boy, gosh, I mean, you got me started, and I cannot really stop when I get talking like this. So you might have to have another podcast or something down the road. But let's revisit Jeffrey Miller in South Korea. I'm sorry, what was that?
I said it's a pretty familiar family trait. We do like long yarns.
Amy and I have been friends since just a few years after you started teaching, so I am familiar with it.
The past year, wow, what can I say? Living here in South Korea, I've been through a lot. I've been through the 1994 nuclear crisis, where we really thought we were going to war. I've been through the 1997 financial crisis, Asian financial crisis. I've been through the 2008 global crisis, other nuclear crises in 2010, 2012. So being sort of in this kind of situation is not new to me. But as a teacher, teaching online was an entirely different sort of thing. But it's not new, because back in the day we used to have sort of like extension courses which were done by video.
That's right.
I remember IVCC. They used to have extension courses. They used to, like, on Saturday they have like this cable access station, and the professor would put up a video, and you have your notebook, your textbook, and you would follow along.
How did you find the adjustment, the sort of transition from a face-to-face classroom to Zoom?
Well, now I teach courses where I have upwards to 50 to 60 students in the class. And the biggest problem for me as a teacher is that I need to see everybody at once. I need to see everybody's sort of their reactions. I mean, as a teacher, this is how we know we're doing a good job. In the classroom, I need to see somebody nodding their head, or somebody, looking off, into space, or I need to see people smiling. I need eye contact, especially in language. You need eye contact. Language is eyes. It's, there's a lot of things going on. That was really difficult. And of course, some students don't like to have their cameras on. And I'm also teaching students, because I'm at an international business school. I've got students from around the world.
Right.
So I'm not just teaching in Korea. I got students from Kazakhstan, from Uzbekistan, from China, from Vietnam. I got students in different time zones.
Right.
So I've got some students getting up at 2:00 in the morning to listen to one of my classes.
Wow.
Okay. So, some students, they don't want to have their cameras on for obvious reasons, because they just woke up, they don't want their friends to see them, and whatnot, or the classmates. So there was that adjustment. Also, it's sort of the communication, like, I'm always looking at my image on Zoom, not at the camera. So I'm really wary of thinking about eye contact. And I always feel like this is like how a newscaster must feel. I'm looking into the camera, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the 6:00 evening news. And I'm not seeing
it.
It's
my dream come true. At last I have my own show.
Exactly. But that is really kind of weird. Sometimes I like just to put my image off, because I tend to look at myself, as I'm talking, which
I think everybody does.
Narcissistic or anything here. But that was the biggest challenge. And also the challenges, like for English, for doing group work, doing presentations. Now, I know some teachers, they use the breakout rooms, but as I heard from my colleagues, that some students do it, some students don't do it. That was a bit challenging. So what I've had to do is I've had to sort of restructure my classes. I've had to redo my syllabi, the way I would present classes. For example, I have a class called Writing and Presentation Skills class. Now, the writing part is easy. Everything is submitted through Turnitin. Okay, it's great. Thank God for Turnitin, because everybody submits their papers. But how do you do presentations? You can't do a presentation in a class because it's not a normal presentation. How do you do a professional presentation where eye contact, volume, all the things that you teach students that this is how you should do it? So I said, well, I'm going to have them do videos, have them record themselves, And I've had students put together some really slick videos. What was really neat is one of the things I teach is they have to write a paragraph about a holiday that best represents the culture. It's really cool to get videos from students from around the world actually dressed up in their native
Oh,
clothing.
that's so fun. My favorite activities are tell me something cool about your country we
Exactly.
don't know.
So, I mean,
much fun.
These are fun, and the students, they love it because, who doesn't like talking about themselves or their culture or their country and sharing it and putting it in a video format. So that was one way I had to do it, how to tweak sort of my syllabus, way I normally do the curriculum in order to continue having presentations. But there still are some shortcomings. We have to be very flexible the past year. We had to be very flexible. We had to think on our feet and be ready for any kind of contingency. Some days I come in, I can't log into Zoom.
Yeah.
Students are waiting for me.
What I was going to say was, can you tell us a little bit about what you think the future for English language teaching in Korea will be like?
So beyond sort of post-pandemic, well, I think what's going to happen is after this pandemic, I think with the technology that we have, that we've been using the past year, I do see that sort of coming more into play. A lot has changed, in the past 30 years, where we have the kind of technology that we did not have 30 years ago. The internet, what we're doing right here, sort of having a Zoom meeting, things of that nature. So I kind of expect to see more of that being employed, sort of in the classrooms. But as far as sort of the future, there are always going to be jobs here. But I know the market is quite saturated these days. I think the salaries have not been sort of, how would I say, they're not really keeping up with the times. And I think the next couple of years are going to be some lean times, because a lot of programs, because of the pandemic, a lot of things have changed. And I think that we may not see as many jobs, because now I think people have realized, well, why do we have to pay teachers all this money when things can be done online?
It's a very interesting situation, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you're absolutely right. You can have, why should I go to the United States, or why should I pay for a teacher in this context when I can just do it online? On the other hand, there is nothing that replaces that face-to-face experience.
Exactly. I totally agree. As a teacher, when I'm in my groove, it's when I'm in the classroom. When I'm online, I'm doing a good job. I'm throwing out the information, I'm lecturing or whatever. But when I'm in the classroom, that's entirely different, because as a teacher, we have to gauge the response from our students. We have to see how they are, and we can see, when you see it on their faces, when they get something, when something clicks, when they're talking to a classmate. We don't get that through Zoom. So what I see is that I think there's going to be a little bit of downtime. I think, sometimes I often say that the golden days of English language teaching in South Korea were probably in the 90s. Okay, I mean, that's when things were good, when the money was good, when schools were a little bit more, I guess, considerate, for teachers. But since then, I think they realize that a lot of us are replaceable, that there's always somebody out there to get a job. And I don't want to scare anybody away from that reality, but I think in the back of our minds, we always have to realize that some people still think that way, that anybody can do what we do. My school actually brought in a teacher training course, and how well it was not received, because the fact is that why are we spending all this money to have a program when we want money? a lot of these schools, they want to be cash cows. They
It's
want to
it's that balance between being a profitable business and but providing education is really
exactly.
a challenge, and it's something Melanie and I talk quite a bit about.
This is something I find very interesting. I feel there's a conflict in ELT because on the one hand, there is a lot of money to be made, and there's a lot of money that's actually being made
trillions of dollars,
right? By certain organizations, certain individuals.
Right.
There's also the fact that what we're teaching is an incredibly valuable capital. You know, it opens doors for people. It gets people into universities. It allows you access to jobs. It gets you the access to different countries.
Exactly.
That's incredibly valuable. However, the people who actually do the teaching tend not to be as valued. That is what I have found. And I can't quite figure out why. I mean, I feel like it's probably really obvious and I'm just missing it, but you would think that the person who's actually supplying that thing of value would be fully valued, and sometimes they are, but I think this idea of irreplaceability and anyone can do it is sort of the other side. I mean, I remember when I first started teaching, and my experience was different. I was in Prague, but like you, it was similar in that the first time I was in a classroom, it was just magic. I loved it. And I remember speaking to my dad about doing this, and I really enjoyed it. And my dad said, yeah, well, you know, the great thing about it is it's pretty easy. And I felt so angry because I was like, it's not easy.
I totally agree. And I think for example, I'm at a business school, okay, and I teach what I call soft skills, English, writing, speaking, things of that nature. These are skills that students will use forever. I mean, if you're going to get anywhere in this world today, you need soft skills. You need communication skills, okay? And this is something that I've learned over the years. And what I always put myself into the student's position of, what would I need to know to function in this language, or I'm in this situation? So I'm always sort of identifying with my students. Every student is different. Snowflakes, right? Every student is different, snowflake in a good sense, okay? And I must address each student's individual needs. They get the basics, but I have to focus on each one. The thing that I've learned over the years is that I get to know students better than other professors who teach the content, because they share. The whole purpose of communication is sharing.
Yeah.
Sharing stuff that maybe they can't share in their own language. Yeah. I remember at ELS where I had women talking to me, and housewives in my class. They would say stuff that they could never say in their own language because they would be ostracized.
Yeah.
I always think that's the value, that I'm giving them something that will help them, whether it's to get a job, whether it's to travel, watch movies without subtitles. Okay.
It's something.
I totally agree with that whole principle there, is that we give value, but sometimes teachers, we're not valued. And
can we make it rain for teachers?
Well, that's what we're going to do. That's our plan.
It's actually one major reason why we started this podcast is with Bounce English. We really want to be kind of a source of support for teachers and help them feel valued and find ways for them to be properly valued. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I was going to ask about is, so when do you think for your school or for South Korea in general, you'll start getting back into face-to-face classes?
We tried last November, and a lot of students, they did not want to come back. They did not want to, they were nervous about it.
International students, you mean?
International students, I had most of my Chinese students, they stayed overseas because of, hard to get into Korea. I mean, we have to do quarantine, for 2 weeks, and it's just kind of fearful. But even students, when they're here in Korea, my Korean students, they said, well, I don't want to be going, kind of nervous about it. So some students are kind of, they're really okay with it being online. But we tried it in November, and we're going to do it for a couple of weeks. And then there was a flare up. And, of course, South Korea, we're really good at the sort of maintaining, sort of controlling things here. Not like, for example, the US.
Not for example.
I have,
that's why she was definitely curious. We spoke a couple weeks ago with a teacher who is now back teaching in China. And what she was describing was really this kind of getting back to normal because the situation was so controlled. And so I was just curious in South Korea, because I know I hear the Western news, but I'm curious, how do you feel it's going? Do you think that
we're doing okay? I mean, I don't know about when we're going to get the vaccines, but I mean, I've just gotten so used to like wearing a mask and just doing social distancing and things like that. But I worry more about my kids. I have 4 kids in elementary school, middle school, and they're really missing out on the best years of their lives. They're missing out like on all that sort of that socializing, which is very important for kids at that age.
Yeah.
But myself, I had a very difficult time teaching online, what we call hybrid courses, and the classes, because I tend to ignore the students on the computer. Because now that I have live bodies in my class, like, oh my God, I have real students. And I felt I was really ignoring the students on Zoom here, not looking at the camera. It was really hard to kind of like adjust while I was teaching, because, I'm in a classroom, we have a monitor, I'm looking here, I'm looking over there, and it's more difficult.
Not really right. We've talked to other teachers about it, and my older sister Kathy teaches high school math and has talked about it. And, one of the things that Melanie has really worked with me on to help understand as a non-ESL professional is that the way you teach a class online is one way, but the way you teach face-to-face is another. And they're just different mediums. You just have to recognize it. And I think this idea of having some of your students present and some of your students...
I hate it. I hate the hybrid.
It's a service to everybody.
I feel like, okay, fine, we can do hybrid, but we need an assistant who's going to sort of manage probably the students who are online, because it's a different style. It's a different method of delivery. And it's really ultimately not fair to you or the students. We have really struggled, I think, a little bit with online teaching because we all made that transition really fast. And then everybody really just wanted to be right back in the classroom, which is great. And I get it. But the problem with that is we're not. And so what we need is training. We need training on how to make those Zoom lessons, I'm going to say at minimum bearable, but actually engaging and effective for the students. I believe that they can be. I really strongly believe that. I don't think it's for everyone. I think there are differences, but I think a major problem we're having is we just haven't moved out of this concept of emergency remote teaching. The idea of making the pedagogy strong just hasn't really been developed yet.
I agree. I think we're going to see a lot. Like, I know some of the co-TESOL conferences, they're beginning to address how to do this. So I think we're going to see a lot. There might be courses which would be available like this. Depends, not because of the pandemic, but because maybe that somebody's going to come up with this really neat way of like, okay, we can get people from different countries to kind of come together, hearing different accents, hearing different things. So we actually might be able to use the technology. But you're right, we all were thrown into this very quickly. Originally, we were told just you could put up videos, and that's fine. Some professors did that. And of course, in Korea, the Ministry of Education said, no, you can't do that. You have to have
actually
online.
Not fine.
Exactly. This has been a lot of fun. And, Korea's a hip and cool place now. It wasn't that way.
I like it.
It was in 1990, Korea was like a diamond in the rough. And
now it's a diamond.
Things happened, by the time we got to the millennium, we got to like Gungnum style, all these things. It's a real hip place. And it's a lot different, very different than it was when I first came here. Things have happened historically here on the peninsula that in many ways have affected English ELT. Back in the Asian financial crisis, suddenly people could not go to New Zealand or Australia to Canada or English to study. They had to stay in Korea. We all thought we were going to lose our jobs in '97, but actually it was a big English boom.
I was going to say that's the great thing about teaching English. You never know where you're going to end up or what you're going to
Exactly.
see. Jeffrey, it's been an absolute pleasure. I think it's
Thank
just
you.
amazing that you and I know someone, we have someone in common. They're probably not
Right.
even the only one. Like there's probably more, because I actually believe the ESL circuit is in fact quite a small world. So
I do agree. I think there's a lot, but the fact that we both know Mark Cleland, that was pretty wild.
hilarious. That is hilarious to me. Anyway, it's been really lovely. I will say goodbye. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you so much, Melanie. Nice to meet you. Take
Nice
care.
meeting you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Come on, baby, let's keep in touch. Come on, baby. Let's keep in touch.